Thank you, Karen, for those kind words. It's a great honor to be here. It's been a great honor to be here and participate all weekend, but particularly to be on this panel with my friend Karen and with Steve and Bob, who are just have been tremendous and really have seen the threat that we're up against before a lot of people even realize. I mean, we talk about the war on terror. These guys knew there was a war on before the people who are currently running the war were even aware that we had a problem. This panel is supposed to be mainly about free speech, but I want to put it in a broader context and try to address how I think things have changed for the worse in the 16 years since the World Trade Center bombing, which is how I got involved in the jihad, so to speak. 16 years ago, when we charged the blind sheikh for and his organization, his cell in New York, which had actually been up and running since the late 1980s, when we charged them for terrorism crimes, the country had almost no experience to speak of with international terrorism, certainly on a systematic, sustained type of scale that we have seen over the last 16 years. And as a result, the arsenal that we had to bring charges was not particularly good. It was reflective of a country that didn't actually have to deal much with international terrorism. For example, if you committed a successful terrorist bombing where you actually killed people, we had laws for that. We had a bombing statute that could get you life imprisonment. There was no federal death penalty at the time. But if you conspired to commit a bombing, even if your intention was to take out tens of thousands of people, we had no statute for that. So you had to bring the case under what's known as the catch-all federal conspiracy statute, where the potential penalty for conspiring to kill tens of thousands of people was 0 to 5 years. And a judge could walk the guy conceivably out the door with no penalty at all. Not that a federal judge, of course, would ever do anything like that. So we had a struggle to try to, what we had was a situation where you saw the wages of treating your national security challenges as if they were mere legal problems. Because the better your national security practice was, and from the national security side, the name of the game is to prevent the acts of terror from happening, the worse it was from a legal standpoint. For example, we would fight with the agents, the prosecutors would fight with the agents all the time, because one of the things we could goose up the penalties with was to charge them with an attempted bombing, which was a 10-year federal crime. But under the law, there was very bad attempt law in the Second Circuit where we were trying this case, because they make a big deal in the law about whether what the guys have done amounts to what's called a substantial step or whether it's mere preparation. So, of course, the prosecutors want the bad guys to be allowed to plot right up until the moment they virtually light the fuse, and the FBI guys and the national security agents, whose obligation first and foremost is to prevent bad things from happening, and then we worry about prosecution later, they want to take the case down right away to make sure that the bombing doesn't get out of our control, the plot doesn't get out of our control, and the plan doesn't come to fruition. So because we had these charging difficulties, what we ended up resorting to was a statute called, a Civil War era statute called seditious conspiracy, which made it a crime to levy war against the United States, or to conspire to levy war against the United States. It was a perfect depiction of exactly what the blind sheikh had been about, how he had created the framework of this cell in New York, and precisely what they were doing. But interestingly, the free speech issue back then was virtually the opposite problem of what we have now, which is we were arguing back then that you essentially can criminalize speech, namely speech that incites acts of violence. The way the sheikh would communicate his directives to his underlings was to put them within the framework of Islamic sermons, and he would cite accurately, by the way, scriptures from the Quran, and that would be basically the green light to the underlings to go ahead and carry out the operations. Now, 16 years later, the problem that we're dealing with is basically the suppression of our own speech. And it's a much more serious national security problem, because if we can't talk about radical Islam, that means that we can't talk about the ideology that actually is the driving force of this campaign of terrorism that we've been facing for 2 decades. There is an ethos in government. It was noticeable in the mid-90s, but it is absolutely calcified conventional wisdom now that there is no nexus between Islamic doctrine and Islamic terror. So we basically spend our time saying that terrorism is driven by American military operations, or Israel, or Abu Ghraib, or Israel, or Gitmo. Did I mention Israel? Yeah. But anything other than what actually drives it, and what we know drives it. And the problem is, if it becomes, as it has become, both politically incorrect and legally more and more difficult to discuss Islamic doctrine, we will never be able to develop a policy that adequately addresses the threat that we're under. If you don't address what causes it, you can't stop it or minimize it in an effective way. And I think that what we're seeing now, the major attack on our free speech rights, comes from the increasing encroachment of international law standards on our own legal system and on the legal system of our allies. And let me just point out a couple of ways I think that that happens. There's been a lot of talk, obviously, in the last week. I know I've had to talk nonstop about it, over the decision by the Obama administration to move Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and 4 other of the 9/11 plotters into the civilian justice system for a trial. I've seen even friends of mine, surprised to see a op-ed in the Washington Post a couple of days ago from Jim Comey and Jack Goldsmith, former Bush Justice Department officials, saying that the Attorney General